for those of you that may not be as familiar with us, we are an international nonprofit organization that works to preserve wildlife through the conservation of invertebrates. And invertebrates are a group of organisms that us and many other critters around the world rely on in order to, be successful, complete our life cycles, so on and so forth. So it's kind of the foundation of our work, and we work on types of animals from freshwater mussels to bumblebees to fireflies to butterflies and everything in between. We were founded in 1971 and originally started as a volunteer-only, butterfly-only conservation group, and over time grew into a 501(c)(3) and broadened our conservation efforts to include all invertebrates. So we kind of graduated from butterflies. We're based in Portland, Oregon, but we have staff all over the country. I am the only Iowa employee and I cover the whole state. But we have a really good, in my opinion, Midwest presence, and we continue to grow. I've been with Xerces for over 6 years, and we're at about 100 staff now, coast to coast. And we work in a variety of different ways to diversify the landscapes for invertebrates, pollinators and beneficial insects, especially really in every space imaginable on all types of farms, within cities and towns, out in the countryside, on campuses. We do a lot of community science and also have a lot of initiatives with education outreach. We have a podcast, lots of webinars. We're kind of doing it all in a myriad of ways. Okay, so that is that. And for the sake of tonight, this is kind of our brief overview. There have been some happenings in the last few weeks in regards to the status of some iconic pollinators. So I wanted to kind of switch gears and acknowledge some of the current numbers when it comes to pollinators from like a big picture all the way down to specifically in Iowa. We're going to cover different habitat options, habitat site prep and maintenance, as well as resources. And we only have an hour for this entire presentation, so I can't necessarily deep dive into any one of these topics, but hopefully it's enough information to kind of get people going, get the wheels turning, and thinking about different conservation actions you may want to take. So thinking on a global scale, 16 and a half vertebrate pollinators are threatened with extinction. And when we say vertebrate pollinators, we're talking about things like birds and bats. In Iowa, we do not have any bat pollinators. The science is kind of out on how productive hummingbirds are in terms of pollination of crops. They certainly can pollinate some flowers, but there's other parts of the world where birds and bats are making, significant difference. Over 40% of invertebrate pollinator species are facing some degree of extinction, particularly with bees and butterflies. We know quite a bit about those groups of insects. So there's a lot of research being done on those. The thing about insects is like they're so diverse, and that can be really challenging to get down to like a species level or genus level or family level to know all the science that's out there. Getting a little closer to home and thinking about North America, 18% of butterflies are at risk, over a quarter of our bumblebees are at risk, 50% of leafcutter bees, and 20% of mason bees. And mason bees are bees that we really think about in terms of early crop pollination for fruit trees, for example, like apples or blueberries or potentially cherries. So it's something to really consider and think about. In Iowa, narrowing down even further, and sorry for those of you that are out of state, I did see some of that. Thank you for joining us. In Iowa, we have some of our own issues going on. We have two species of butterflies that no longer call Iowa home, the Poweshiek skipperling and the Dakota skipper. These were once documented within the state, but have not been documented in over 10 years. And after a certain point of time, we consider species to be extirpated or lost, essentially. The rusty patch bumblebee was listed federal, well, and I should say, they're both federally listed. The rusty patch bumblebee was federally listed in March 2017, and it is extirpated from nearly 90% of its historic range But in Iowa and other surrounding states like Minnesota, Illinois, Wisconsin, we do have individuals and populations that are still existing, and we're still finding records of them around here. So they're not extirpated for whatever reason, but they're still a conservation concern. They still need a lot of help, mainly because they have been absent from a lot of their historical range. And now, kind of the new-ish news is that the regal fritillary, which we have two different populations of within the country. We have the eastern population, which occupies only like a county worth in Pennsylvania, a very, very small population, and then the western regal fritillary, which is the butterfly that exists everywhere else. So our western regal fritillary was proposed as threatened, I believe, in either August or September of 2024, and then in December of 2024, the monarch was proposed for a threatened listing as well. So those are kind of new happening things with the Endangered Species Act that is administered, and that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is kind of responsible for and takes care of. In regards to, federally, we have the Endangered Species Act for protection, but then states also may have a state wildlife action plan. And within that action plan, there's a bunch of, it could be plants and animals. In Iowa, we have plants and animals. And so we have our own state level, basically, concerns or our own listings for these types of species. The only insects that we have currently within our state wildlife action plan are butterflies. So we have 2 endangered butterfly species, 5 threatened butterfly species, 25 species of special concern. We have 110 butterflies that occupy the state, whether they're migratory or non-migratory. So that's, about a quarter or so of those, of the butterflies that call Iowa home at one point or another are considered at risk. So with all of that said, what can we do about these numbers? How can we make an impact, and how can we help potentially stabilize or reverse some of these numbers when it comes to insects and vertebrates? Because the silver lining to the doom and gloom is that insects and invertebrates can be quite resilient if given the tools in order to complete their life cycle. The beauty about insects is that they can exist in relatively small spaces in comparison to other wildlife species. So they're, the little things that we do really can make a difference. And planting habitat at really any scale is the #1 conservation action that anyone can take. And habitat can take many different forms, from, potted plants on a balcony in an apartment to our roadsides across the state. Iowa is known for their the Iowa Roadside Vegetation Management Program, our IRVM, where different counties can adopt that program to convert roadsides or manage roadsides for natives, our urban farms, our gardens, our parks, et cetera, et cetera. And habitat is important because it provides food, first and foremost, which comes in the form of pollen, nectar, and host plants for butterflies and moth species, shelter, breeding opportunities. They're able to find one another relatively, easier, and protection from pesticides. It also contributes to a lot of other things like cleaner water, cleaner air, healthier soils, aesthetics, lots of mental health benefits. I love walking around my yard or in other prairie plantings, or really in any sort of nature landscape. It gives me a general boost to see things, to see some life, and in much more, community engagement, education, etc. So tonight we're going to be focusing primarily on the small scale habitat options in regards to natives. I did think and kind of consider while putting this presentation together that sometimes the size and scale and plant materials can kind of dictate different strategies. So I will be talking about a number of different ways to implement, and not necessarily thinking in acres and acres, but also like a quarter of an acre or maybe up to an acre, and how that's could still be considered small, but that there can be different strategies on how to actually accomplish each one of those things. And so these are just some examples of different habitat options people can put out there. I don't have enough time to go over every single one of these, so I'm just going to cover a couple of them, show a case study. But this is just to get people thinking and that they can be implemented in a variety of different spaces. So beetle banks are a fun habitat option that could be incorporated into small scale farms or specialty crop farms, your garden. But basically, their function and their main purpose is to help with conservation biological control. So using our natural enemies or our good bugs to combat our unwanted pests and undesirable bugs that may be, um, hurting your crops. And they're also designed primarily for the ground beetles. Ground beetles are excellent beneficial insects. They eat weed seeds, they eat aphids. They provide a lot of services that, we hardly even notice. And the reason that they are planted predominantly with native bunch grasses is that is the structure that is preferred for the ground beetles. So we really want to create an environment that fosters their activity and that keeps them there for the long run in order to be providing the ecosystem service of natural pest control. So they prefer native bunch grasses for overwintering and nesting. So sod forming grasses are not their jam. They do like space and bare soil to maneuver around. And we, historically have planted them like 100% native bunch grasses, nothing else. But lately, in the last 5 or 6 years, Xerces in the upper Midwest has been experimenting with diversifying those mixes and adding some wildflower or forb species into it to be able to support an even larger amount of beneficial insects and pollinators. And there's talks out there, and I could do a whole other talk on beneficial insects and conservation biological control. But the thing is just, of course, that more plants, different colors, different bloom times, different shapes, sizes are going to attract just a wider variety of the insects that we're trying to conserve. And many of our pollinator species were predaceous and had a completely different diet or was doing something entirely different at a different life stage. So, flower flies, for example, are predaceous as larvae, so we would consider that a beneficial insect. But once they complete metamorphosis and they turn into an adult, their diet completely changes, and they may be feeding on pollen or nectar or both. So having that wildflower component is really, really nice. Tree and shrub plantings, I don't think get enough credit. They can be really beneficial, especially if space is potentially an issue, or site prep, or just kind of the planning. Um, there's not enough time or whatever. They have, in comparison to these other plantings of native herbaceous plants, there's less site prep involved. They take up less space, and it's kind of less management, and they can still provide food. Many of our native trees and shrubs are flowering, and they flower earlier than a lot of certainly our prairie species, and even some of our like spring ephemeral and woodland species. So that is a really important food source for bees, our early emerging bees. Many of them are host plants to butterflies and moths, and many of them can also provide nesting and overwintering opportunities. And there's a wide range of different varieties that are native to the state and beneficial to pollinators. So that's just a few examples. But really today we're here to talk about like how do we do these things? I think a lot of us are sold on the idea of pollinators, but maybe not quite sure how to implement and what to think about when, considering implementation. So we always want to be prepping the site, there we go, in order to install the plants to give them the biggest opportunity to be successful for the long term. And the size and the scale of the habitat is really, really important and may dictate which site prep method you choose and what is feasible for your site, as well as, what kind of soils do you have? Is it really dry? Is it mesic? Is it wet? Is it a combination of things? Are there wet spots and dry spots? What's the sun exposure? and what's the existing vegetation. Is it just one weed like turf grass, or do you have a spot that maybe has broad leaves and grasses that are undesirable? And how do we address those things most effectively? What kind of equipment do you have available? Is there any reason that you would need heavier equipment like a tractor or a large mower? Water, if we're thinking about live plugs, which I'll be talking about, water and irrigation is going to be really critical. And of course, like hands, bodies, time, and labor. And when it comes to small scale habitat, I think the beauty of it is that we can be pretty creative. Like, I love kind of telling people, like, what do you have available to you? What do you have laying around? And there's a lot of different options. Pictured here is an example of a community garden in Waterloo that took out some areas that had previously been in production, but that just weren't producing well for whatever reason. And so the weed pressure was relatively low because they had been in production for a few years. So they, tilled up the crop that they had previously and they planted crimson clover and they let that die out. And they actually used the leftover biomass as kind of a mulch and planted directly into it. And that didn't have any adverse effects. But tarping with black tarp or silage tarp or literally a tarp, solarization, sheet mulching, which is basically taking a lot of different biodegradable materials like grass clippings or leaves and mulching them together, maybe putting cardboard on top of it, but getting creative in that regard. Of course, conventional pesticides may be an option, organic pesticides, or just repeat tillage. So I will go over some of these. Solarization, we've done quite a bit of work with. That's the use of clear plastic, 6 milliliter, or yeah, 6 millimeters, there we go, is ideal. We do this a lot on our specialty crop farms because they typically have high tunnels or greenhouses and they have extra plastic laying around and available to them. New clear plastic is super duper expensive. Used plastic is much better, and it's, putting it at another purpose and not being super wasteful because um, we do like to be pretty careful about the waste aspect when it comes to clear plastic. We want to be using it for at least one growing season, and we do acknowledge that it's not a silver bullet for every weed out there. Like Canada thistle, for example, is still really problematic, and solarization may not be the best option if that is a weed of concern. And really what we're doing is creating undesirable growing conditions. So it is absolutely pertinent to prevent airflow um, with the plastic being laid down. And, if there's deer pressure, checking to make sure that any tears or rips or holes get patched. And also acknowledging that absolutely do not till after it's been, once you pull off the plastic, you can plant right into it. Do not till it. You might invigorate some weeds. This is an example from Minnesota, where it's a very small scale planting in a community garden setting, and they decided to use solarization. And in this example, they buried the plastic in order to prevent the airflow. Here, they used some bricks. It had a clear boundary. They put up a sign. It looks like something's happening here, and the space has a purpose. And I think that's really helpful, so people aren't wondering what the heck's going on. And a few years later, it's a beautiful little insectary strip of native plants. But especially if you're, at your house or on an acreage or what have you, I say get creative. If you're working in a small scale situation, I don't think, you need to spend a lot of money on it or think about it too much. The example on the left is actually one of my first little small pockets of native plants from my house. And I laid cardboard down in November and I left it there until late or mid-May the following spring and then planted into that. Whatever weeds may have been growing, I hand pulled them. I've since added on to this strip, but like starting off small, piecing it together and utilizing, I had a lot of cardboard and I had a lot of bricks. So that was what I did. The example to the right, a similar situation, just do the best you can to prevent the airflow. So if, you've thought about site prep, you've got that figured out, you understand how big things are, or what the scale is, and all like going through this presentation, it's just important to think about like just keep thinking about the scale with a lot of these considerations. So scale will influence your plant materials. At Xerces, we advocate for a tenth of an acre or less. It's pretty okay to use live plugs. It's not too laborious. It's not too intense. Um, and it's not too expensive. Plugs can be expensive. So doing like a quarter acre of plugs could cost a lot of money, or more than that. And it's also, a lot to weed, a lot to water, a lot to plant. So taking all of that into consideration. And so generally anything greater than a tenth of an acre, case dependent, of course, we're going to be looking at seed. And there's different ways to prep sites also when it comes to scale, kind of using non-traditional or organic options for site prep, can work just fine on a small scale. But if you're thinking about an acre or several acres, that gets a little harder to achieve, and we have to think a little more intimately about it. And it's a lot different starting with a live plant that already has a root system versus a seed that has to germinate and create its own root system. So thinking about the existing weed pressure that you're trying to get rid of prior to planting. When we are planting via plugs, we're typically planting every foot to 2 foot or somewhere in between. We really like to clump the same species in small groups, like groups of 3, for example. And this really just kind of congregates similar food sources so that insects don't have to travel very far. Adding native bunch grasses and carex are absolutely critical. They not only are like grasses aren't not only host plants to butterflies and moths, but they add structure, they add texture, they're beautiful. They can help with management in terms of if it's a big enough space that you can use fire. That's going to help move that fire along. It can help suppress other problematic weeds. And as far as species composition is concerned, depending on the site, you may use short statured plants or a mixture of tall and short. On a lot of the farms that I work on and other kind of municipality city plantings, we're often looking at kind of shorter stature plants, just that they're easier to manage and deal with versus, 6 foot tall plants. And I should also, now that we're just we're on the topic and I'm thinking about it really quick, it's also important to acknowledge that when planting via plugs and doing these smaller scale plantings with natives, they often behave in a way that is different than what you might see in an actual prairie or on a 10-acre reconstruction or 5-acre reconstruction or 2-acre reconstruction. The space is very limited. There's a lot of competition, and so they may grow even more robust than they naturally would in kind of a more natural situation. So when we think about height, that is definitely something to consider because something that's already tall, maybe even taller. Um, so just a random thought there. There's a lot of different ways to plant plugs, get creative with what you have. This is an example of a beetle bank from that same farm from the previous slide, where they're just planting in rows, totally acceptable. Flagging out an area is really helpful. And the best time to plant plugs, which I mean, I'm speaking to the choir here. A lot of you, I'm sure, are master gardeners. You understand how to plant. But capturing those spring and early summer rains is really ideal. So, your mid to late May, June timeframe. But certainly, we can plant native plugs throughout the growing season, so long as that irrigation is available. And okay, before I get to that, and when installing the plants, they will need water the first few weeks, just depending on the local conditions and how much rainfall you may or may not be getting. But if you've watered sufficiently, you're getting sufficient rainfall, you generally don't need to continue watering them throughout the entire summer. They are able to fend for themselves. And certainly the next growing season, like they do their thing, you don't have to worry about it. That's the beauty of native perennials. Yeah, I think that's all I'll say about that. So I'm going to switch gears just a little bit because, again, like that size and scale and, objectively thinking about what is small for some folks may be very different. So if we're thinking at like a quarter of an acre, half acre, or acre or more, um, seed is going to be the best option because it'll be cheaper, less labor, so on and so forth. So there's a couple different ways that we can seed native seed. And using a no-till native seed drill is an option and ideal. In this scenario, there's not a lot of, that is bare soil that they're planting into. The beauty of a drill is that if you happen to have some biomass or a thin layer of biomass on the ground and it's not completely bare soil, that is okay. The drill allows that seed to soil contact. The main thing to remember is that we absolutely cannot be burying seed. They need to be planted at the max a quarter of an acre or a quarter of an inch or less, eighth of an inch. Most of the time, I just tell people just put the seeder on the ground and don't do anything else. Native seed comes in many different shapes and sizes, and if it gets buried too deep, it will not germinate. So that is the logic behind that. And calibration is also very important. And oftentimes I mean, all the time, I should say, we are also combining our native seed with what we call a bulking agent. Even if you're planting acres, you typically get like a lot of seed that's like tiny. And you're like, this is going to do, 6 acres, this tiny bag of seed. So we use bulking agents like oats or sand or kitty litter or sawdust, basically at a 1-to-1 or a 2-to-1 ratio to bulk up the seed to make sure that it's evenly being distributed across your entire planting area. And so we do that whether we're drilling or whether we're broadcasting. So broadcasting can be as simple as a hand broadcast, which I've done on like a quarter acre planting. But if it's, a lot more than that, there's tools like fertilizer spreaders, drop seeders. This is me doing a planting with a Vicon or a drop seeder is what some people call it. When it comes to broadcasting, the seed to soil contact absolutely is critical because it is just dropping onto the seed. There is no extra tool or mechanism to, kind of help ensure that it gets the seed to soil contact. And it must be rolled or cultipacked or integrated into the soil one way or another post seeding. In this situation, John Judson had the equipment to not only seed, but then cultipack immediately following. So, he's doing 2-in-1 in this example. All right, now we're going to move into kind of the establishment, maintenance, long-term management phase of the program here. So when we're thinking about plugs, which I should have been more specific on this slide, apologize for that. I've already mentioned, but irrigation is very, very important to ensure that roots are able to establish and these plants can survive. And that will be, that'll be different for every place. And when thinking of plug plantings, the weeding is also super crucial within that first year. And we really want to be prioritizing perennial introduced weeds and trees. Trees can be very problematic to deal with long term if they are not removed as young seedlings initially. They'll just keep coming back. So the sooner that you can target and remove those without them, establishing their root system, the better. Mulch is highly encouraged to not only help you with weed suppression, but also keep in moisture. We prefer to have a thin layer of mulch. We don't want several inches of mulch. We want to make sure that it decomposes within like a growing season or two. That way, we are not creating any barriers for soil ground nesting bees. We want our pollinators and other insects to have access to the soil for their own transportation and for nesting sites and overwintering sites. So there's a variety of things that people have used and that you can use: straw, grass clippings, wood chips. Um, some folks plant into, slots of cardboard. but you want to ensure that there's space around that plug or that plant to when you water, it's actually getting water. I experimented with that on a new little patch of planting just this past summer, and yeah, it was okay. It was fine. Don't know if I'd do it again, but it was worth a shot. So thinking about plug plantings and kind of the longer term maintenance, it's a lot of the same as any other prairie planting. They do kind of thrive on disturbance, but a lot of it is still going to be weeding, but you could mow or weed whack, or in some scenarios, you may be able to actually burn off that vegetation. Leaving areas of refugia, that is a practice that we advocate for and talk about regardless of the size of the planting, whether it's in acres or in square feet. And it is okay to, keep the planting tamed, especially if it's, your yard or in a city. Like you still want functionalities of other aspects of your yard. You don't need these native plants to like completely take over your life and dictate everything you do. So trimming them back, keeping them from being a nuisance or flopping into cropping areas or walkways or what have you, it's totally fine. And I would say, this is a big, big, big thing that I wish I would see more of is just keeping the habitat the same and not touching it moving into the winter. Oftentimes, a lot of plantings, whether it's like residential landscaping or et cetera, you see that in the fall, folks come through and they cut it down like this short. Um, it's useful for us and it's handy and it makes less work coming the next spring, but it's not super beneficial to the critters that we're trying to conserve. They really need the structure in that habitat in order to survive throughout the winter. So for nesting and overwintering purposes, so we always talk about leaving the leaves. You don't have to leave every single leaf. That's excessive. And certainly like leaving the leaves isn't going to necessarily save the world. But if you have the opportunity to have designated areas where you're leaving the leaves, great. If you want to leave every leaf, fine, you do you. But that's just a fun tidbit that we advocate for. And then saving the stems and not cutting them back until later in the spring, just to ensure that there are nesting sites available. And this is a really neat little brochure that we don't have in print, but we do have it on our website, that really kind of walks you through, why that's important and why we wait, and just basically we want like the house and the food to be near each other. Many of our tunnel nesting bees are solitary bees, so those are single females that are responsible for finding the nest, creating the nest, getting food for the offspring, defending the nest. And so since she is doing all of that work all by herself, we don't want to create spaces in which she's going to have to travel really, really far to get food to feed her young, therefore not being able to defend her nest, leaving it susceptible, so on and so forth. And this photo, or the photos here, are not the greatest. It's very hard to see, but this was, I think, a goldenrod stem. So some of our native species already have hollowed out stems, just naturally pithy stems. And but if you look somewhat closely, you can actually see that there's pollen remnants around the entryway of the stem. And on the lower photo, I actually captured the bee going into the stem. So it's super hard to see, but it was cool to like witness it in real life and be like, okay, right on. We're doing it. Okay. And I'm sorry that I feel like I'm jumping back and forth between these two kind of different styles of habitat here, but I just didn't want to leave anyone out. So when we think about establishing native seedings, it's going to be a lot different. In the Midwest and in Iowa especially, this may differ if you're in different states and different regions, but we typically are mowing our newly planted seedings the first growing season, ideally 3 times. That depends on how much rain that we're getting, and over the growing season, we seem to be getting less and less. But once that vegetation reaches about 18 inches, we're going to cut it back to 6 to 8 inches. If I've worked with folks that have an acre, half acre, quarter acre, and only have riding lawnmowers, they don't have this nice bush hog that can go up and down quite a ways. We basically just take that down smaller. So instead of letting things get to 18 inches, we're going to maybe just let it get to 10 inches and then cut it in half at probably 4 to 6 inches, however high the mower deck gets. So we can adapt that to the scale of the project. But that is a really critical thing to do just to ensure that you're preventing the plants that you don't want there to not reproduce, not go to seed, and then also ensuring that there's light to get down to the native seedlings. Native species, the first couple of years, their main objective is to create their root system. So they're doing a lot of things under the ground that we cannot see. And it takes a while for them to then pop up. So lots of practitioners talk about how a prairie, the first year it sleeps, the second year it creeps, the third year it leaps. This is an example of what I would consider like a small scale seeding scenario. This is about a quarter of an acre. It's not the entire space, but we did hand broadcast the seed in 2020. And then it had its first full prescribed fire, I believe, last spring in 2024. The owner of the prairie burned a little sooner than I would have liked, but it's all good. And with that, I would just say that the timing of a prescribed fire, for example, if that's a management tool that's available to you, this person lives on the edge of town, but technically the county, so they were able to burn. Um, you should prioritize your management goals and your problematic weeds initially. For the first few, I don't know, maybe in the first 10 years, first 5 years, 6, 7 years. If there are problematic weed issues, time your management activity, whether that's burning or mowing or haying or grazing, these larger scale plantings. Yeah, target those things first and foremost. That way, just let the planting kind of get its footing, kind of create its own immune system and defense, and set it up for success that way. But fire frequency is always going to be case dependent, always. But once it gets to kind of a sustained, comfortable scenario, roughly every 3 to 4 years, doing some sort of management activity, whether again, prescribed fire, grazing, haying, mowing, etc. And in terms of those small scale plantings, basically just keeping up on the weeding. Like, you know how it goes. But hopefully those native plants get bigger and fuller enough that they are able to kind of maintain their space for the most part. And hopefully you're only targeting like specific weed issues like Canada thistle or Butzfoot trefoil or those really problematic perennials that might be kind of a constant issue. We're never going to get rid of weeds entirely. That's unrealistic. Should probably check time here. Okay. So that was a lot of information and a lot to kind of jam in a relatively short amount of time. But hopefully it was somewhat helpful. I will do some specific resource shout outs. Just somewhat recently, we came out with this new publication on really like installing kind of these smaller scale habitats using plugs. And it talks about all the placement considerations and the mulching and the irrigation and different types of plants. And it is technically a national document, but it's broad enough to be applicable across different regions. If you want to learn more about native bee biology and ecology, how to identify a honeybee versus a sweat bee or a longhorn bee, or to tell the difference between a wasp and a bee, our Upper Midwest Community Scientists or Science Monitoring Guide is wonderful. The pollinator-friendly parks, that really just gives you a nice rundown of a lot of the things we talked about today, but just thinking about how to add diversity into those types of spaces. Our website, of course, like has a plethora of resources available to you. If there is anything specific that you are looking for, I am always, and our staff are more than happy to help find those things for you. Because sometimes it can be rather daunting and it's like, this is what I'm looking for. Is there something that fills this? Please tell me. That is totally fine and acceptable. That never bothers me. But just know that we have a lot of publications on a lot of different topics related to invertebrates, restoration ecology, pesticides, etc. And also just want to kind of wrap up this whole thing with, acknowledging that really the beauty of this type of conservation work is that big or small, every effort really does count and it really, really makes a difference. And I'm going to do a shameless plug here and also just try to the last ditch effort to convince anyone that if you build it, they will come. I had a happy visitor in my yard, so that one of the cardboard photos, I had like one plant of swamp milkweed and was lucky enough this August to have a male rusty patch bumblebee, which is only the second recent record. And by recent, I mean like from 2016 and on. I don't think there'd been any records really previous to 2016. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But there's been very few records of rusty patch bumblebee in Boone proper, which is where I live. And the only other recent record we have is another gal who had native habitat in her yard, and it was butterfly milkweed. So plant milkweed, you might get a fun encounter. And so that was really rewarding and really a testament that, like, small square footage really makes a difference. Um, Special thank you to anyone who's on the webinar today and is a member of the Xerces Society. We so appreciate you, and your dollars make up a good portion of our revenue every single year. It really is individual donations that help drive our work, about 40% plus or minus any given year, which is huge. If you're not a member, we highly encourage it. And also thanks to all of our other supporters. It takes many hands for us to be able to do the really important work that we can do. And yeah, many people across the country and across the world that enable us to be able to share all the information that we learn. And with that, I hope I at least left 10 minutes or so for questions. And again, always feel free to reach out if need be. Thank you.